I always thought the hardest part of losing a parent was the funeral. Turns out, it's what happens after the lawyer reads the will. I walked out of that cold wood-panelled office still hearing his voice in my head, and before the sun could even set, the house where I grew up was listed for sale. Not a conversation, not a discussion, just gone. My stepsister Caroline stood by the lawyer's door, arms folded, wearing that same smile she used when we were kids, and she stole the last piece of birthday cake. Calm, certain, victorious. "You know it's what Dad wanted," she said, voice smooth as silk but sharp enough to cut through my chest, except I knew better. Dad and I talked about that house 100 times. He never planned to sell it, but his signature was on the new will. And my name wasn't. I tried to steady my breath as I walked through the courthouse parking lot, but it felt like the whole world had tilted sideways. That's when I ran into Mr. Gilmore, our old neighbour from 2 houses down. He gave me a polite but pitying smile. "Emma, I heard about the will. Tough break. Guess the house is going to Caroline now. Shame. Your dad loved that porch swing." He meant well. But those words hit harder than anything in that lawyer's office. It wasn't just about losing a house. It was about losing my place in our story. And the worst part, no one was surprised I'd been written out of it. I thought about going home, pretending none of this mattered, but then I remembered something. Something Dad whispered to me once on that same porch swing when the world felt cruel. A family doesn't fall apart unless someone lets go first. I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. So I turned around, pulled out the worn key from my pocket, and headed for the one place Caroline probably hadn't bothered to check. Dad's old study. If there was any truth left in this story, it would be there, buried beneath the dust, waiting for someone brave enough to look. I barely made it up the front steps before someone called my name. "Emma?" I turned to see Uncle Frank, standing by the rose bushes with his arms crossed, his brow furrowed like I was a stranger trespassing. He hadn't called me by name in months. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone halfway between concern and warning. "Caroline said you wouldn't be coming back." I swallowed hard. The key in my hand suddenly felt heavier. "This is still my father's house," I said, keeping my voice steady. He sighed, shifting his weight as if trying to decide whether to argue or retreat. "Look, I don't want to get in the middle of all this, but the way I heard it, your dad made his wishes clear. Caroline's handling everything now." The words stung, not because they were true, but because so many people already believed them. I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Funny, Dad never mentioned cutting me out in our last conversation." Uncle Frank hesitated. His gaze softened just enough to show the cracks beneath his firm stance. Sometimes, the things they don't say are the loudest. And just like that, the weight of absence hit me all over again. He gave a small nod toward the front door. "Whatever's left in there, I hope you find it fast. Caroline's meeting with the realtor this afternoon." And then he left me standing there, alone on the porch of a house that no longer felt like mine. I slipped the key into the lock and turned it, the familiar click echoing like a distant memory. The air inside smelled like dust and forgotten summers. Everything was just as Dad left it, except colder, emptier. I paused in the entryway, letting my eyes adjust to the shadows. Was I here to reclaim something, or just to say goodbye before someone else slammed the door for good? I made my way to the study, footsteps slow, heart even slower. The desk sat untouched, papers stacked neatly, the old brass lamp casting familiar shadows across the walls. Somewhere in here, I knew Dad left something for me, a note, a clue. Maybe even the truth that Caroline didn't want anyone to see. I opened the top drawer and found it, an envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with my father's handwriting across the front, for Emma, in case I'm not there to explain. My fingers trembled, but my resolve did not. I took a deep breath and broke the seal. I barely had time to open the letter when I heard her voice cut through the hallway. Cold, familiar, final. Well, back already? Couldn't resist snooping, could you? Caroline leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, smile sharp enough to slice through the air. Behind her, Uncle Frank lingered, his expression unreadable, but somehow softer when he glanced at her. I folded the letter closed, not yet ready to reveal what I'd found. "This is still Dad's house, Caroline." She laughed, quiet and cruel. "No, Emma. This was Dad's house. Now it's... well, let's just say you're a guest who overstayed her welcome." Uncle Frank cleared his throat, stepping forward as if to calm things down. Maybe it's best to let things settle, girls. No need to stir old wounds right after a funeral." But his eyes didn't meet mine. They rested on Caroline's instead, waiting for her lead, not mine. I clenched my fists at my sides, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Dad and I spoke about this place. He promised..." Caroline cut me off, her voice ice cold. "Dad promised a lot of things when he was sick, but paperwork speaks louder than memories." The room fell silent. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. I could have shouted, demanded proof, called out every lie she spun over the years, but all I said was this: "What are you so afraid I'll find in here?" Her smile flickered, just for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Nothing you haven't already imagined, but keep digging, Emma. I'm sure you'll find ghosts in every corner." She turned to leave, her heels clicking down the hall like the closing bars of a prison cell. Uncle Frank gave me a half-hearted shrug before following her, his loyalty already chosen. And then I was alone again, not just in the house, but in the story they'd written without me. I placed the letter carefully into my coat pocket, the weight of it pressing against my heart. If this house no longer had room for me, then I'd carve out the truth myself, even if I had to stand in the cold hallways of my own family's silence to find it. I didn't expect anyone to still be in the house, but as I turned to leave the study, a soft voice stopped me. "You shouldn't let her get to you like that." I froze, then turned to see Lily, my cousin, leaning against the doorway. She looked the same as always, book in one hand, guarded smile in the other. I hadn't spoken to her in months, maybe years, but in this moment, her presence felt like a crack of light in a sealed room. "Did you hear all of that?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended. She shrugged, stepping into the room. "This house has thin walls, and besides, Caroline isn't exactly subtle." I gave a tired smile, sinking into Dad's old armchair. "Seems like she's already convinced everyone I don't belong here." Lily sat across from me, resting the book on her lap. "Not everyone," she said simply. "Some of us remember who used to help Grandpa fix that leaky faucet in the kitchen. Some of us know this house wasn't built by paperwork." Her words caught me off guard, gentle, honest, and exactly what I needed. I hesitated, then pulled the letter from my coat pocket, showing her the familiar handwriting on the front. "Do you think there's a chance Caroline forged something, that this will isn't what Dad intended?" Lily's expression turned thoughtful, brows furrowed. "I wouldn't put it past her. I heard from Rachel, remember, Caroline's old roommate, that Caroline was meeting with Dad's lawyer weeks before the hospital stays. Late-night meetings, private talks. Rachel said she overheard them discussing expediting plans before Dad even mentioned changing the will. The words hit like cold water, and no one questioned that," I whispered. "Caroline's good at making people think she's doing them a favour." Lily paused. "But sometimes the people who smile the most are the ones hiding the biggest cracks." For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than hurt, maybe purpose. I stood, slipping the letter back into my coat. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for still seeing me when no one else does." Lily gave a small smile. "Don't thank me yet. Go find out what that letter says, and if you need backup, I'll be here." It wasn't a rescue, but it was enough to remind me I wasn't entirely alone. The lawyer's office looked different this time, colder, less like a place of answers, and more like a vault where secrets were buried. Mr. Caldwell sat behind his desk, glasses perched low on his nose, flipping through papers like they were grocery receipts instead of pieces of my family's life. Caroline was already there, seated comfortably, her smile practiced and perfect. I cleared my throat, placing the sealed letter gently on the table between us. "I found this in Dad's study," I began, voice steady despite my racing pulse. "He left it for me, and I believe it changes everything you've been told." Caroline let out a soft, condescending laugh. "Emma, how long are you going to chase ghosts? Dad made his decisions. Just because you found an old note doesn't mean the legal process stops." I ignored her and turned to Mr. Caldwell. "Can you verify his handwriting? You knew my father longer than any of us." Caldwell adjusted his glasses, examining the envelope with careful fingers. After a long pause, he nodded. "It does appear to be Robert's writing, but whether what's inside holds legal weight, we'll have to see." I met Caroline's eyes, waiting for the flicker of doubt, but she stayed composed. "Even if it is his handwriting," she said smoothly, "Dad updated his will with me present. This is nothing but sentimentality, legally irrelevant." I stood a little taller. "Sentimentality doesn't erase intent, and it doesn't explain why you met privately with Dad's lawyer weeks before his health declined." That caught her off guard. For a second, the room held its breath. Mr. Caldwell looked between us, frowning slightly. "Emma, do you have proof of these meetings or their content?" I glanced at Caroline, whose smile faltered just enough to confirm my suspicion. "Not yet," I said softly. "But I will." Caroline gathered her purse, rising from her chair like a queen ending an audience. "Then I suggest you stop wasting everyone's time until you do." She turned to leave, her heels clicking across the polished floor, but this time I didn't feel small watching her go. I looked back at Mr. Caldwell. "Will you help me verify what's in this letter?" He sighed, but there was something almost kind behind it. "Bring me whatever you find. I'll help where I can. For Robert's sake." I exhaled slowly, the first breath of resolve settling in my chest. This wasn't over. Not yet. That night, the lawyer's office felt a world away. I sat alone in my apartment, the letter still tucked safely in my coat pocket, replaying every word Caroline said. Was I chasing shadows? Or worse, clinging to a version of Dad that only existed in my memories? The silence stretched until my phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, its sudden ring cutting through the doubt. Rachel. I hadn't heard from her in months. Caroline's old college roommate, the girl who always saw through her charm. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the answer button. Then I picked up. "Emma, it's Rachel. I heard about the will, and I think there's something you should know." Her voice carried an urgency I hadn't expected. "Caroline visited Mr. Hensley, Dad's previous lawyer, weeks before your father's last hospitalization. She told me it was just to discuss some paperwork, but I overheard parts of their meeting." I leaned forward, heart racing. "What did you hear?" Rachel paused, then spoke softly, as if afraid of saying it aloud. "She was pressuring him to expedite changes to your father's estate. She mentioned that Dad was confused, vulnerable, that it would be best to formalize things before his condition worsened." My stomach twisted. She framed it like she was protecting the family. Rachel continued. But it didn't sound right. Not the way she said it. The pieces clicked into place, faster than I could stop them, and Caroline hadn't waited for Dad's wishes. She shaped them while he was too weak to fight. "Why are you telling me this now?" I whispered. Rachel exhaled, voice softer, because I couldn't live with it anymore, and because no one else will stand up to her. For the first time in days, I didn't feel entirely alone. "Would you be willing to tell the lawyer? To help me prove it?" There was a long pause on the line. Then Rachel answered, "Yes, I'll meet you tomorrow." I let the breath leave my body in a quiet rush. The fight wasn't over, and now I had a witness. I didn't sleep much that night. The city outside my window hummed with late-night conversations and distant sirens, but inside, my thoughts were quieter than ever, not empty, just still. For the first time since the reading of the will, I felt like I could finally breathe. The truth was out there now, fragile, but real, and tomorrow I would carry it into the very room where Caroline thought she had locked the door behind her. I opened Dad's letter again, reading his handwriting one more time. "If you're reading this, it means the conversations we never finished are still waiting for you to carry forward. Don't be afraid to stand where others walk away." I smiled softly, the ache in my chest a little lighter. This fight wasn't about a house. It wasn't even about the will. It was about not letting someone rewrite the story of a man who spent his life teaching me what integrity looked like. I pulled out my notebook and began writing down every piece of information I had. The letter, Rachel's testimony, the lawyer's handwriting verification, the timeline Caroline claimed versus what actually happened, piece by piece. I rebuilt the narrative that Caroline tried to erase. I wasn't sure if it would hold up in court, but it would hold up in my heart. And sometimes that's where you start. Morning came sooner than I expected. I packed the letter and my notes into a simple manila folder, sliding it into my bag. I paused by the door, glancing back at the small apartment that had become my quiet refuge, for now, at least. As I locked the door behind me, I whispered softly to myself, "Dad, I hope I make you proud today." The courthouse loomed ahead, not as a place of fear, but as the next step forward. Whatever Caroline said, whatever the lawyer decided, I would finally have my voice in the room. Mr. Caldwell's office felt warmer this time. Maybe it was the morning light filtering through the blinds, or maybe it was the quiet understanding in his eyes when I placed the letter and my notes on his desk. He took his time reading them, not rushing to dismiss me, not trying to smooth things over. When he finally looked up, his voice was softer than I expected. "Your father spoke to me about changing his will months before his health declined, but when Caroline brought me new paperwork, she claimed it was his final request. I questioned it, but without proof. I had no grounds to stop it." I leaned forward, heart pounding. "So you knew something wasn't right?" He nodded slowly, fingers steepled in thought. "Robert always said you were his anchor, Emma. He wouldn't have left you with nothing." The words settled over me like a gentle hand on my shoulder. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding. "Will you help me prove it?" He gave a small smile, tired but kind. "I'll testify to what I know. I can't change what's been filed, but I can stand beside the truth." It wasn't victory, but it was no longer a battle I had to fight alone. He handed me a copy of the original draft of the will, the one Caroline never mentioned. It wasn't finalised, but it showed clear intent. The house, the accounts, the legacy Dad built, meant to be shared. "She had the paperwork amended before your father could sign this version," Mr. Caldwell said. "But his voice is in here, Emma. Maybe not legally, but morally." I ran my fingers across the faded ink, feeling Dad's presence in every word. "I'll take this to the court." I said quietly. Mr. Caldwell nodded. "Anne, I'll be there when you do." I gathered the papers, the weight of them surprisingly light compared to the burden I'd been carrying alone. As I left his office, the autumn wind caught my coat, cool against my skin, but somehow refreshing. Like I could finally breathe in something new. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I wasn't stepping into it alone. The house was colder than I remembered. Maybe it was the late afternoon shadows stretching across the floor, or maybe it was the weight of knowing what had been stolen here, quietly, without a single slammed door. I made my way back to the study, letting my fingers trail across the worn furniture Dad used to polish every Sunday afternoon. If there was one place he would have hidden the truth, it would be here. I started with the bookshelf, not the obvious drawers Caroline would have searched, but the places only Dad and I knew. Third shelf from the bottom, behind his favourite biography of Lincoln, the book he always said taught him about honesty. And there it was, a slim envelope tucked between the pages, marked simply, "Draft, not final." I pulled it free, my hands steady despite the rush of adrenaline flooding my chest. Opening it carefully, I found the draft will, the one Mr. Caldwell had mentioned. The words were clear. The house, the family accounts, and the keepsakes were to be split fairly. My name wasn't missing. It was right there, in black and white. Before Caroline had changed everything, I sat down heavily in Dad's old chair, the reality washing over me. He hadn't forgotten me. He never planned to leave me out. On the desk beside me, something caught the light. A silver glint beneath a stack of old receipts. I brushed them aside and found it. Dad's silver bracelet. The one he wore every Sunday dinner. The one he promised I'd have someday. I turned it over in my hands, tracing the family initials engraved on the inside. It wasn't just jewellery. It was legacy. Proof of belonging. I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for me all along. Tears threatened the edges of my vision, but I blinked them back. This wasn't over yet. I gathered the draft will, tucking it safely into my bag alongside the final letter. As I stood to leave, I paused at the doorway, glancing back at the study one last time. It didn't feel like a battleground anymore. It felt like home. And I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I found them in the dining room. Caroline, perched at the head of the table like a queen, scrolling through her phone, and David, pacing by the window, his hands restless in his pockets. He looked up first, tension written across his face. "What's going on, Emma?" he asked, voice sharp but not unkind. "Uncle Frank said you were digging through Dad's things." I held up the draft will, the pages steady in my hand. I wasn't digging. I was finding the truth Caroline didn't want us to see. Caroline's head snapped up, her smile tight and brittle. "Don't do this here," she warned, voice low. Not in front of him. But I didn't back down. "Dad never finalised the version you filed. This draft shows he wanted the estate split, not handed over." David stepped closer, glancing between us torn. "Is this true?" he asked Caroline, his voice quieter, more fragile. Caroline stood, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress. She spoke calmly, but the crack in her tone betrayed her. Dad changed his mind in the final weeks. He was tired, confused. He asked me to simplify things for the family's sake. "For the family's sake," I echoed softly. "Or for yours?" The room went still. David's brow furrowed, doubt flickering behind his eyes. "You scheduled the house listing before the funeral, Caroline, before the will was even read." His voice trembled slightly. Why rush something Dad never talked about with us? Caroline's mask slipped, just for a moment. "Because someone had to be practical," she snapped. "You both were too busy feeling sorry for yourselves while I handled the paperwork, the hospital bills, the lawyers. I cleaned up Dad's mess while you grieved. I met her gaze, steady. You call his life a mess. Her silence was answer enough. David turned away, running a hand through his hair. The room felt colder than the autumn wind outside. "This isn't over," Caroline hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think a draft changes anything? Courts don't run on sentiment." I smiled, quiet but certain. "No, but people do. And this house, this family, deserves more than legal shortcuts." For a moment, no one spoke. And in that silence, I felt the balance shift, just a little. The living room filled slowly that afternoon, as family trickled in for what Caroline called a final estate discussion. It felt more like a coronation. She sat at the head of the room, legal documents neatly stacked beside her, her voice smooth as she explained the logistics of the house sale. Most nodded politely, too tired from grief to question her efficiency. Until I spoke. "There's one thing we haven't discussed," I said, my voice quiet but clear, heads turned, some surprised I was still here. Caroline's smile barely faltered. "Emma, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I interrupted, calm but steady. "Because before we talk about what happens to the house, we need to talk about what Dad actually wanted." I placed the draft will on the coffee table, alongside Dad's letter. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the old ceiling fan overhead. "This," I continued, tapping the draft, "is what Dad wrote before his health declined. He wanted the estate shared, the house preserved, his legacy respected." Caroline crossed her arms, voice cold. "That draft was never finalised. Legally, it means nothing." Uncle Frank shifted uncomfortably. Aunt Grace frowned, looking from me to the papers. "But morally," I said, "it means everything." The words hung in the air, heavier than any signature. David finally spoke, voice hesitant. Why didn't we hear about this draft sooner, Caroline?" She straightened, the facade slipping just slightly. "Because it wasn't finished, and Dad was confused toward the end. I was trying to protect the family from chaos. Or from choices he made without you," I asked gently. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. I didn't push further, didn't need to. I let the silence work for me. Because sometimes the quiet says what shouting never can. Caroline gathered her papers with a forced smile. "Well, if anyone here wishes to contest the will, they're welcome to waste the court's time." She stood, her voice final. But this time, no one followed her out of the room. I remained seated, the draft will resting beneath my hands, not claiming victory, just holding ground. Before anyone else could speak, Uncle Frank cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Emma," he said, trying to soften the edge but failing. "Sometimes people change their minds when they realise what's best for the family." I turned to face him, my chest tight. "Are you saying Dad didn't know his own wishes until Caroline explained them to him?" He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I'm saying, maybe Caroline saw what you couldn't. You left, remember? You weren't here when things got hard." The words struck deeper than I expected. The old accusation, the quiet judgment. I opened my mouth to respond, but Caroline spoke first, her voice almost gentle this time. "It wasn't personal, Emma, it was practical. You have your life elsewhere. This house, it's just bricks and memories. Dad didn't want it to become a burden." Aunt Grace, who'd been silent all along, finally spoke up, her voice hesitant. Maybe we shouldn't fight over something he tried to make simple. The paperwork is clear. Maybe it's time to accept it and move forward." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the room. No one was yelling, but that didn't make the words hurt less. I looked around at the faces I once called home. Most of them weren't angry. They were just tired of conflict, tired of grief, and tired of me stirring it all up. I took a slow breath, feeling the quiet weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. I didn't come here to fight, I said softly. I came here to remind us that this house wasn't just Dad's, it was ours, and it deserved to be remembered for what it meant, not just what it's worth. For a second, no one moved. Then Caroline gave a small, knowing smile. But memories don't pay property taxes, Emma. Sentiment doesn't fix leaking roofs. Her words landed with the precision of someone who knew exactly where my wounds were, and yet I didn't flinch. Maybe she was right about the roof, but wrong about the heart. For a moment, the room was still, not silent from peace, but from exhaustion. I looked down at the draft will, my fingers resting on the familiar handwriting. Dad's voice echoed in my mind, quiet but steady. A family doesn't fall apart unless someone lets go first. I stood, not raising my voice, but letting it carry the weight it needed. Dad once told me, I began, that family isn't about who signs the final paper, it's about who shows up, who stays when things get hard. Caroline rolled her eyes, but I kept going, my voice steady. He built this home for all of us, not so we could divide it like an inheritance, but so we'd have somewhere to return to when life knocked us down. Uncle Frank shifted in his chair, uncomfortable but thoughtful. David looked down at his hands, silent. I could see it. Small cracks in the certainty Caroline tried so hard to cement. Maybe the draft will doesn't change the court's decision, I said softly, but it changes mine. I won't fight over this house like it's a prize, but I also won't pretend Dad's voice didn't matter. I folded the draft and slipped it into my coat pocket, the action final, but gentle. Caroline's smile was thin, brittle. Touching speech, she said dryly, but sentiment doesn't sign closing papers. I met her gaze, calm, number, but it lives here. I tapped my chest. Long after closing papers collect dust. I turned to the rest of the family, speaking one last time. If any of you still remember what this house meant before it became a number, I'll be at the lawyer's office tomorrow, not to fight, just to finish what Dad started, with or without the paperwork. And then I left the room, not waiting for applause or argument. Sometimes, the strongest stand is the one you walk away from. I thought that would be the end of it, but as I reached the front hallway, I heard her voice behind me, quieter this time but sharp as ever. Running away doesn't make you right, Emma. I turned to see Caroline leaning against the banister, arms crossed, mask of confidence cracked just slightly. I'm not running, I said calmly. I just don't need to win your way. She let out a humourless laugh. You always did live in your own little world. Dad protected you from how hard things really were. My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice steady. And who protected him when you were planning this behind his back? Her smile faded. For the first time, something real flashed across her face. Hurt, maybe, or regret she didn't want to name. You think I wanted this? She whispered, voice barely holding together. I spent years watching him slip away, cleaning up his debts, managing the house he couldn't afford anymore. Someone had to be the adult. I softened, but only a little. Then why not tell us? Why carry it alone and then rewrite the ending without us? Caroline looked away, swallowing hard, because no one ever listens to the one who isn't his real daughter. The words hit like a slow punch to the chest. She wasn't just protecting an inheritance, she was protecting herself from being left out. Again, I took a slow breath. Dad never saw you that way. You know that. She wiped her cheek quickly, covering the crack before it spread. Doesn't matter now. The papers are filed. The house is sold next week. I stepped closer, voice low but steady. You can sell the house, But you can't sell what it meant to him or to us. That stays whether you acknowledge it or not. For a moment, I thought she might argue, but instead, she let her shoulders fall, just slightly. Then take your memories, she said quietly, turning toward the stairs. But don't expect them to pay the bills. And just like that, she was gone, retreating up the stairs, as if running from ghosts only she could see. I stood alone in the hallway, feeling both heavier and lighter at the same time. The fight wasn't finished, but something deeper had shifted. The next morning, the house was quiet, in a way that felt less like emptiness and more like rest. I walked down the hall, sunlight filtering through the dusty windows, catching the quiet places we all used to fill. The kitchen table still held the coffee cup Dad always left out, as if waiting for the next conversation that never came. And there, resting beside it, was something I hadn't expected. The silver bracelet, placed gently on the worn wood, exactly where Dad used to set his keys. No note, no explanation, just the bracelet. Caroline must have left it before she left the house that morning. I stood there, unsure whether to smile or cry. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't theft either. It was a choice, a quiet one. The kind Dad would have understood. I picked up the bracelet, its familiar weight warm in my hand. She could have kept it, pawned it, or hidden it away out of spite. But she didn't. Somewhere beneath the years of rivalry, disappointment and silence, Caroline still remembered what mattered. I slid the bracelet onto my wrist, letting it rest there like it always belonged. And for the first time since the will reading, I felt like maybe we both wanted something simple. Not the house, not the money, but peace. I didn't know if we'd ever speak of it. Maybe we'd never agree on what Dad wanted or how things should have been handled, but in that one quiet moment, without witnesses or paperwork, we understood each other in a way only family, broken and messy as it is, can. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sitting alone at the kitchen table. No war to fight today, no speeches to give, just quiet. And sometimes that's enough. By midday, the decision felt clear in a way the conflict never did. I didn't need the house to feel close to Dad. I carried him with me, in his letters, his lessons, and now, in the silver bracelet resting on my wrist. Ownership wouldn't fix what was broken. Letting go would. I gathered the draft will and the lawyer's notes, slipping them into my bag one last time. As I walked through the empty living room, I paused by the old fireplace. The photos were still there. Family moments frozen in happier years. Caroline's face beside mine, both of us younger, unguarded. I smiled softly. Some parts of our story were worth keeping, others worth leaving behind. At the lawyer's office, Mr. Caldwell greeted me with that same tired kindness. "Ready to contest it?" he asked gently. I shook my head. "Number, I'm ready to release it." He blinked, surprised. "You're letting it go?" I placed the draft on his desk, my voice steady. "File the draft as a record of Dad's wishes, but don't fight for the house. Let Caroline keep it. If it gives her peace, that's worth more than any court battle." He studied me, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Your father would have called that leadership, not surrender." I smiled back, lighter than I'd felt in days. Maybe, or maybe I'm just tired of holding on to things that only weigh me down. I signed the final papers, closing the chapter the only way I knew how, quietly, but on my own terms. As I stepped outside, the autumn air felt softer, carrying the scent of change. I didn't win, but I didn't lose either. I found something else entirely. The new apartment was smaller, 2 rooms, a narrow kitchen, and windows that looked out over a street that never seemed to sleep. But for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. No memories clinging to the walls, no shadows of arguments past, just space. quiet, imperfect space. I unpacked slowly, stacking Dad's letters in the bookshelf beside a second-hand lamp, hung the silver bracelet on a small hook by the door, somewhere I'd see it every day but wouldn't have to carry it constantly. Outside, the world moved on without me. Kids raced down the sidewalks chasing soccer balls. Neighbours argued gently over who parked too close to the hydrant. The city breathed, uncaring and alive, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to catch up. I took a walk down to the corner cafe Dad and I used to visit when I'd come home from college. The place had changed, new owners, new menu, but the same warm smell of cinnamon and quiet music in the background. I sat by the window, watching strangers go about their lives, wondering if any of them carried ghosts the way I did. Probably. Maybe that's what life is, figuring out how to carry them without letting them anchor you in place. The server smiled as she poured my coffee. "First time here?" she asked kindly. I smiled back, soft but real, number just starting over. She nodded, understanding more than words explained. I sipped the coffee, letting its warmth settle the last fragments of yesterday. No grand declarations, no final victories, just this moment, simple, quiet, mine, and somehow that was enough. That night, I sat by the window, notebook open, pen hovering over the blank page. It had been years since I'd written anything for myself. Life had a way of pulling you into its noise, leaving your own voice somewhere behind. But tonight felt quiet enough to listen. I wrote the sentence Dad used to tell me when I doubted myself. You don't have to fill the silence to matter in it. I let the words sit there on the page, still and steady. And then, for the first time since the will reading, I smiled. Maybe that was the lesson all along. Not fighting to be heard, but learning to hear yourself, even when no one else is listening. I closed the notebook and looked out at the city beyond the glass. Lights flickered in windows across the street, small fragments of other people's stories still being written, and somehow it didn't bother me that mine looked different. Quieter, but no less full. I reached for the bracelet, running my thumb across the familiar engraving, Dad's initials. And now, in a way, mine too. I thought about Caroline, about the weight she carried in silence, too afraid to ask for help, about how easy it was for both of us to believe we had to fight alone. Maybe we still would, but maybe, someday, we wouldn't. I didn't know if we'd ever sit at the same table again, but I knew this. I'd stop carrying the past like a sword and start carrying it like a story, one I could set down when it got too heavy. I stood, letting the quiet wrap around me like a blanket. Not lonely, just still, and sometimes that's all you need. A week later, I returned to the house one last time. The realtor had left the front door unlocked, the final walkthrough scheduled for that afternoon. Soon, someone else's story would fill these rooms. I stepped inside, letting the quiet greet me like an old friend. The walls no longer held arguments or secrets, just echoes, and maybe that was enough. I walked through the living room, fingers tracing the places where photo frames used to hang, past the kitchen where Sunday pancakes left syrup stains Dad never quite cleaned. Upstairs, the bedroom doors stood open, sunlight pouring across the floors like forgotten laughter. In the study, I paused. Dad's chair remained, its cushion worn by years of quiet reflection. I sat down, letting the room settle around me one last time. From my coat pocket, I pulled out the notebook, the one I had filled with thoughts and half-written letters these past few days. On the first blank page, I wrote the sentence Dad once told me beneath the oak tree out back. Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you pass forward. I left the notebook on the desk, beside the old lamp, a quiet offering for whoever came next, whether they knew the story or not. On my way out, I paused by the front door. For years I imagined leaving this place angry, broken or victorious, but today I just left whole. No house, no fight, just peace. I closed the door gently behind me, locking it for the last time. As I stepped onto the porch, a breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of wind chimes Dad once hung by the garden fence, software familiar, and for the first time I smiled without sadness. The house would have new owners, but the story it carried, our story, lived on in me, and that, I realised, was enough. I stood at the end of the driveway for a moment longer, watching the wind stir the fallen leaves across the pavement. Funny how life keeps moving, whether we're ready or not. Dad used to say, sometimes the quiet things are the ones that stay the longest. I didn't understand it then. I do now. I slipped my hands into my coat pockets, feeling the cool metal of the bracelet against my wrist. A part of him, a part of me, and maybe a part of the future. The house disappeared behind me as I walked away, not in sadness, but in peace. It was never really about the walls or the roof. It was about the people who filled it, the laughter, the arguments, the quiet mornings, and the way we tried, sometimes failing, sometimes not, to love each other anyway. Maybe that's all family really is. A series of imperfect moments we keep trying to make right, even when it hurts, even when it's hard. I reached the corner where the mailbox still leaned slightly to the left, just as Dad left it. A small, crooked reminder that not everything needs fixing to be enough. And as I turned the corner toward my new life, I whispered softly to the wind, to myself, to whoever was still listening, thank you for loving me even when I didn't know how to love myself. And maybe, in some quiet way, the story wasn't over. Maybe it was just different now. And if you've ever stood at a crossroads like this, letting go of something you thought you couldn't live without, tell me, what helped you find peace in the end? I'd love to hear your story, quietly, whenever you're ready.